You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering on December 17th, 2025. Thanks for tuning in. All right, friends. Well, tonight we're taking another Advent pause to lean into one of its main themes, namely the theme of week 3, which is joy, which might feel interesting to some of us, right? Or even strange, depending on where we're at in this season. Because joy isn't always the word that arises most naturally in December, especially not if we're honest. Sure, there's glitz and glam and the joy of children who are excited for Christmas morning. But this time of year also carries with it a lot of longing and grief, exhaustion or uncertainty, and a whole mix of emotions that get layered together, right? So when we hear joy, it can sometimes sound thin or forced, like something we're supposed to feel rather than something we actually feel and participate in. Do you know what I mean? But the joy that Advent gestures toward isn't surface level happiness. It's not cheer. It's not even some kind of naive optimism. It's actually something deeper, something sturdier, and something that can coexist with the complexity of our world. And so tonight, I want us to explore joy as a felt sense of rightness. Joy as what arises when things are, even if only briefly, aligned. Joy as what emerges when we glimpse the world as it could be. In the contemplative tradition, joy often shows up quietly. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand attention. It comes as a soft recognition. This is actually how it's meant to be. Think about moments when you felt that. Maybe it's the feeling of a clean, ordered space. You know, a room that's been tidied, where there's a table set, and a house that's ready to receive people you love because everything is in its right place. Kara and I were feeling that way this last weekend as we prepared for the Way Collective Christmas party. There's a calm that settles into the body when everything is in its place. Again, even if it's only for a short time before the kids mess it up or before the guests come, right? There's a sense of ease and a kind of gentle gladness, not because life is perfect, but because something feels right. Joy in this sense isn't excitement. It correlates rather with coherence. And this is where Advent becomes quietly radical, because Advent joy doesn't stop with our inner lives. It doesn't stop at personal peace or even individual well-being. Advent joy imagines there being peace on earth. And so Advent joy imagines the whole world being brought into alignment. Not just us, but society. And not just society, but all of creation or the entire planet. There's an ancient Hebrew poetic tradition that's older than Christianity that names joy as what happens when the hungry are fed, when the bowed down are lifted up, when those on the margins are seen and protected, when power is rebalanced, and when mercy widens its reach. That tradition insists that joy isn't disconnected from justice. Joy is actually what justice feels like when it begins to take shape. And there's another ancient voice that I know many of you know, this time from a young, poor, pregnant woman named Mary, who sings about that joy with startling clarity. Her song, which is called the Magnificat, as many of you know, imagines a world where the powerful are unsettled, the lowly are lifted, the hungry are filled, and mercy stretches across generations. So what's striking is not just the content of her vision, but the tone, right? She sings this, she rejoices, she delights, which tells us something important. This reordering of the world isn't meant to be grim. It's not meant to drain us of life. It's meant to give life away. So Luke 1 mentions her singing a hymn over the child in her womb, saying, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, because God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly." God has filled the hungry with good things and been merciful. So joy here is not a reward at the end of the work. Joy is actually the energy within the work. And yet, let's be honest, we have to realize that we don't yet live in that world, right, of justice, where joy is everywhere. We live in a world where things are deeply out of place, where inequality is normalized and suffering is often explained away, where power protects itself rather than the most vulnerable, where even spiritual language can be used to make peace with injustice rather than imagine its transformation. So sometimes spirituality gets used to tell us this is just how things are, or worse, this is how things are supposed to be. You know, there's this line from an old hymn called All Things Bright and Beautiful that I'm always reminded of that says, "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate." Now, when you hear it closely, it sounds less like good news and more like resignation to the status quo, right? Like a blessing that's actually placed on imbalance, or like an imagination that stopped imagining it could be different. It actually, to me, sounds like the opposite of Mary's song. So that's what happens when religion or spirituality loses its prophetic edge, when it becomes too comfortable and it merges too easily with systems of power. And historically, this shift didn't happen overnight, but there was a moment I know many of you know about in the 4th century that we sometimes call the Constantinian shift, when there was a movement rooted in shared resources and mutual care and solidarity with the poor that became entangled with empire. So faith moved from the margins to the center of power, and in the process, something essential was lost. But Advent refuses to let us forget. Advent keeps returning us to songs and poems and visions that insist the world does not have to stay like this. So what's interesting is that this understanding of joy as justice didn't just belong to the prophets or even to Mary's song. It also shows up in the work of deeply contemplative Christian voices, people who spent as much time attending to the inner life as they did to the outer world. So Howard Thurman, who was a mystic and theologian and a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., understood this profoundly. He writes a lot on Christmas. He writes Advent devotionals. And Thurman insisted that the spiritual life was never meant to be an escape from the world's pain, but rather a way of seeing it clearly without being destroyed by it. He believed that joy arises when a person's inner life becomes aligned with the deep movement of love and dignity that's at the very heart of reality. So Thurman spoke of a rhythm to the universe that beats toward wholeness, and that our task isn't to force that rhythm, but to learn how to listen for it and to live in tune with it. So for him, justice wasn't merely a social program. It was the outward expression of an inward attunement. When the soul is rightly ordered, the world begins to be imagined differently. And that imagination matters because when people lose the ability to imagine a more humane world, they often settle for survival rather than joy. So Thurman warned that oppression doesn't only wound bodies and systems, it slowly erodes our inner lives, and it dulls our capacity for delight and hope and trust with one another. And recovering joy then becomes a spiritual act of resistance. In that sense, joy isn't naive, it's courageous. It's what happens when we refuse to believe that injustice gets the final word. So joy emerges when we sense deep in our bodies that life is still leaning toward wholeness, even when the evidence feels mixed or completely gone. That quiet confidence is what gives people the strength to keep loving, keep imagining, and keep showing up. Because joy in this tradition isn't about comfort, it's about truth. It's about alignment with ways of being that give life. It's about the world being reordered. And this brings us to a question that feels especially important for communities like Way Collective. How do we hold joy at the center of a justice-oriented spirituality? Because if we're being honest, Those of us who care deeply about justice can sometimes forget joy, can't we? We can become so serious, and even when we're earnest, it can feel heavy. We can carry the weight of the world in ways that slowly drain us of our delight. I always go back to this Sister Simone Campbell quote because I think it's so on point. And she once said that joy is at the heart of the human journey. And too often, progressives or liberals are really grim. And she says it's not a good advertisement. Come join us. We're miserable. And you know what? I think she's right. Joy isn't a distraction from the work. Joy is what reminds us why the work itself matters. So in contemplative practice, joy often arises when we stop forcing outcomes, stop trying to control, and start trusting direction. When we sense that life itself is leaning toward wholeness, even if it's slowly and unevenly or imperfectly happening. Joy is what happens when we glimpse that deeper current. And so tonight, I want to invite us to reflect, not on joy as something we should feel, but on joy as something you may actually already know. Where have you felt that quiet sense of rightness in your body or your heart? Where have you experienced coherence, even if it was only for a flicker or a brief moment? Where has life felt aligned and spacious and true? And then gently, without pressure, what might it look like to extend that joy outward? What would joy look like in our shared life, in the way that we gather, in the way that we listen to each other, and in the way we imagine the future together? Advent never asks us to fix everything. It just asks us to pay attention, to notice where joy is stirring, to notice where the world feels out of joint, and to trust that imagining something better isn't naive, but rather it's at the very heart of Mary's song and the song of communities like ours. So joy in this sense is an act of resistance to the bad news cycles that we see every day. It refuses to let injustice have the final word, and it insists that another way of being together is possible. So as we move toward Christmas, I want to leave you with this gentle invitation. This season, don't chase joy. Listen for it. Notice where it arises naturally in beauty, in connection, in the laughter of children, in generosity, in tiny moments of alignment in your life. And when you feel it, when you can recognize it, let it teach you something about the way the world could be. Because Advent joy isn't about escaping what's really going on. It's about belonging and widening that circle of belonging to one another, to the earth, and to the unfolding life that holds us all. Okay, so maybe that's enough for us tonight. I'm looking forward to talking about this, and I've got 3 questions for contemplation and conversation. The first question is the self question. Where have you recently felt a quiet sense of rightness, a moment of ease or coherence or joy in your body or inner life, even if it was brief? And what do you notice when you return to that moment? Number 2, the sacred question. In what ways do you experience joy not as excitement or happiness, but as a deeper sense of alignment or trust, perhaps as a subtle invitation toward wholeness or compassion or love? And lastly, the society question. What parts of our social or political life feel most out of alignment right now? And how might joy help us imagine responses that are more life-giving than simply being reactive? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.